Hello and welcome back to the KLNS Rugby Podcast. Back this beautiful Thursday morning with a bonus pod because we have to discuss some very important news in Irish rugby, and maybe not even the one you're thinking of when I say that. But on Tuesday, the IRFU announced a further tweak to the previously titled Central Contracting Model. And with me to throw a more professional eye over this is host of the Provincial State of Mind podcast, Owen Harrison. Owen, it's great to have you on. Like we joked before we started that there's just so much news. Like it is absolutely insane this week. But we'll start with the central contracting stuff or the new national player contracting system, as it's now called. Do you want to just give people an explainer as to what this news was, what it means now, and what it'll mean, as we move along?
Yeah, sure. I suppose let's go back because I think a lot of people sort of forget the origins of the central contracting model. So if you go back to the mid noughties, there was about 25 to 30 central contracts spread pretty evenly across Ulster, Munster, and Leinster. Connacht had a few, I believe, at the time, but not as many as the three others, but it was split fairly evenly. Then we got into I suppose the from 2014 on, that started to change significantly. The things had dropped before that slightly, but they became very few being issued around that time. And once New Sephora took over, it started coming to the point that they were only for guaranteed status, which wasn't the case previously. So what was happening then was when they were being renewed, and because of Leinster's dominance, it got into a situation whereby, particularly since COVID, Leinster have, I think, as it stands this summer, Leinster have 11 central contracts.
I think so, yeah.
Munster have one, Connacht have two, and Ulster will have zero. So that's where it stands. Now, to this is not seen as a good thing, both I think outside of Leinster and outside of Ireland. It's seen as, because of the way these central contracts are funded by the IRFU centrally, they're seen as I suppose, taking money from the international game and injecting it into one specific club, supercharging that club. Because what happens with the central contracts is, in those cases, you have 11 Leinster players who were being fully paid by the IRFU from international money, and that's allowed Leinster to be one of the few teams that can actually compete with the French salary cap. They're actually, and I think it's fairly well accepted now, they're well above the French salary cap once this is taken into account. Um, and the way that it's David Humphreys has come in, he's looked to make changes to this. So one of the first changes that the RFU have done was they put in a change back to a 70-30 split for central contracts. That it was, the way it was initially announced, was up to 30%, so that the province would contribute 30% of that and the RFU would contribute 70. And that was seen as a way to rebalance things, and rebalance the financial power that Leinster had, because they were actually reliant on these central contracts to keep their team, because they're not financially independent. That up to 30%, based on David Humphreys' discussions and press release this Tuesday, is seems to have changed, and it's now they're charging 30% of all contracts. So that's a fairly significant hit. Um, and the news from David Humphreys then was, not only is it 30%, but it's going up to 40% in August 2026. And that will then bring a case where the extra funding will be reallocated specifically to the player development pathways in Connacht, Ulster, and Munster. Now, in a roundabout way, the main thing behind this is that the IRFU see that they are too reliant on a small subset of private schools within the Dublin area, and largely within the D4 area, realistically, to produce players. And no matter, they don't have to put the funding into those. They put a small bit of support in there, but they don't have to put funding in. So those players will continue to churn out. What they have to do is create different pathways to add to that, which is not necessarily happening at the moment. Um, so I think that's the big one, and it's going back specifically into player development.
Yeah. And that ultimately is a positive thing. And as you said, I do think the IRFU are conscious that, you know, you even look at the breakdown of the Leinster Academy and how much of it comes from two or three schools. They are conscious of this being a factor and want to balance it out. And the way David Humphreys has phrased it of almost want to lift all boats is probably the best way of looking at it. It's not about tearing down Leinster to bring up others or whatever. It's about, well, we have this money anyway. It's still all coming into the IRFU in some capacity. Let's just spread it around as opposed to the old model, which would have been a case of, we're going to pay for this player and this player and this player centrally. But there's also the fact, and we'll get onto a little bit later with Europe, they probably don't want to be seen to be paying 100% wages anymore with, especially when you look at the URC and the Welsh region, the budget is going up to 6 million, and £6 million is probably close to what the RFU pay in centrals as is with the new changes anyways. But just kind of moving on from there, so like we have that explainer, but just also what it means because okay, Leinster could look at it and say, well, we're going to have to fork up a lot of money for a lot of players who got boosted onto these contracts. But as kind of Ian Costello and others have said since, it's not massively like you kind of, if a player gets pumped up anyway, you're basically just paying the same amount and he gets paid the rest. But what does it mean then for for the provinces financially? Weird that I couldn't say that in the kind of short to medium term.
Well, I think in for someone who's going onto a central contract, it doesn't mean a lot because, as you say, if right now you have in your budget, 200 grand on a player and he's suddenly going to 400 grand on a central contract, by the time that splits out, you're not going to be paying too much more than you were originally from the 40%. You'll probably make even a small saving off it, and that doesn't matter. The issue comes in, and specifically for the likes of Leinster, because they have 11 central contracts. Vast majority of cases, they have been paying for those, or say they haven't been paying for those. So 100% of that has been paid by the IRFU up until recently. Now it's 30%. This is the first year that 30% has come in. So it's hitting Leinster particularly hard this year and will continue to do so. Their money that they had initially for players like that who've been on central contracts for a long time have been wrapped up in what I would consider is overinflating wages within the Irish system because Leinster are having 11 out of their starting 15 paid for wholly by the IRFU. That means that they can afford to pay starters pay to the guys on the second tier underneath that. And that overinflates the sort of the wage economy within Irish rugby. That's
Can I
going.
jump in there for a second? Because that is actually very similar to what we've seen. And I'm not trying to insinuate the Leinster have broken any rules because they haven't. They've just got the most out of the system. But that's exactly what we've seen from Saracens back in the day. They were able to pay starters money to like two scrum halves, for example, and to Ben Hurl on the bench and to, maybe three centres. And that's where that ripple on effect happens. And funny, I say three centres because obviously a centre was a focal point of the conversation this week. But that is kind of what it does create, and I do think it's very well established from David Humphreys that straight away when he came in, I want to rectify this. It's not going to be, just pull all the funds, but it is slowly but surely rebalancing, and that's probably what we're starting to see here.
Yeah, I think very much so. It's all about the rebalance of it. I think that the idea is it's to reduce the cost to stop that sort of imbalance within the Irish system. I think you're already seeing impacts on that. You're seeing like this season, I think you're seeing what Humphreys has done, um, how he has gone about his business. There's been impacts at the provincial level. And like one of the big things is Leinster would not have let Ross Byrne go. Leinster would not have let Harry Byrne go on loan previously. But I think now what you're looking at is you're looking at a province who has to make savings. Like, they would have kept Ross Byrne on a high provincial contract rather than anything, and would have kept him there as someone sitting in the sort of a backup 10 backup system. Um, Now he's leaving to join Gloucester. That doesn't happen. I think you also saw it potentially with the likes of Ross Maloney leaving to join Bath. This was the start of this coming in. This, not necessarily the 40%, but certainly I think they knew that the 70-30 was coming in. They have to balance books. They can't continue to keep these guys on. Now, What Humphreys wants is more in interprovincial moves, so that he can see the talent getting in and getting started. But he is somewhat being tied up by what Andy Farrell is doing at national level as well. Because as long as Andy Farrell continues to go down the depth chart at Leinster to get his guys for cohesion reasons, then that's going to cause more and more problems for Humphreys. And I think what you're seeing here is an outside sort of fight between Humphreys as sort of director of rugby, director of performance with the IRFU versus a Andy Farrell as head coach.
No, and I do agree. And that is like ultimately it's not Andy Farrell who selects the central contracts. It's not just, it's not just one insular thing, as is the case for many decisions in rugby, but it is a case of as you said, as long as he continues to go cohesion ball, it's going to have a ripple effect. And again, it's prudent that the IRFU look at this and say, how do we reestablish? Because I'm sure David Humphreys would have looked even at the Joe McCarthy contract. And this is nothing against Joe McCarthy, but if Ulster have none and Ian Henderson's one of their highest earners and they're having to fork up a certain amount for that, probably at least 70% of under the player of national interest deal, they're probably thinking, well, maybe we can do more to help, and then that down the line, Ulster won't be held captive almost by this loss of three central contracts in the last 5 years. But kind of just moving on, like I was going to touch on the Ioane thing. I think that's all fairly set in stone. This is probably a move it's probably one that we're going to see more of, the short-term contracts. Now, contrary to popular belief, he's not coming over to play for 15 quid an hour or anything like that. Like he's going to be well paid. He's going to you know be very heavily used by Leinster, but probably the way forward for them. But I do want to touch on kind of the knock-on effect, in terms of women's rugby, because we've spoken about it really briefly on this podcast before, that there is a desire to have four professional teams in Ireland, four professional provinces in Ireland, so that they can establish a women's URC. There's not a single mention in this press release about women's rugby, which is rare for the IRFU in the David Humphreys era. He's been very forthright that this is something he wants to address, unlike his predecessor. Do you think maybe we can't say, but do you think a part of this new scheme is going to look at pathways of women's rugby as well? Because even just looking at the AIL, like the night before we recorded, Suetonians pulled out the AIL, and there's teams pulling out every 2 years, it feels like. Do you think this is something they're going to look at as well with this newfound purse of cash?
I'm not sure. I'm not so sure it's a newfound purse of cash. First of all, because look, you're taking the same money. It's just where you distribute it. I think what it is doing is it's saying that Leinster specifically have a significant advantage in terms of the stadium available to them and what they're doing and the money, the sponsorship opportunities, the revenue streams that they can generate. And they're saying you don't necessarily need to have the base funding, which is similar to the other provinces, plus your all your advantages, your population advantages, socio-economic advantages, and all that on top of it to supercharge one team. So I think they're rolling back on that. How they redistribute it will be slightly different. I think the Ricky Ione story is a little bit of a red herring because he's going to be paid, as far as I understand it, similar to Barrett. That's going to be an external sort of benefactor is going to take care of at least the vast majority of that. So I think that's separate. That is an investor that doesn't generally pay into sort of what I would call the grassroots level. It's not going to change into sort of women's rugby either. So I don't think that necessarily looks at it. I think what may happen is it'll depend on whether the IRFU take the full 40% and look to redistribute it into the pathways, or whether it's only the 10%. Now, I think there's varying different stories that have been heard on this, and I know Ian Costello has mentioned that it's the 10%, and maybe that's the case. 10% doesn't work out at a huge amount. You're maybe talking when you sort of put it down, you're maybe talking 150, 200,000 a year. And while that may seem like big money, reality is that's maybe what you're talking, maybe three, four guys, development officers, full time, going around and sort of working with on the pathways. Is it a few extra S&C coaches? you're not getting into necessarily building fundamentals of capital projects or like training bases that they're building down in Musgrave and things like that that can be done out of this over a short-term basis. So I think there are sort of impacts, but it depends on the volume that they're putting back into it. And for me, in terms of the women's rugby, I know you mentioned four and a URC, women's URC coming up. I don't think four women's teams in Ireland is sustainable. I think they'll go down the route of the Clover and Wolfhounds, where they will look to combine it. I think it will probably have two. I think it would be good to have that women's rugby professionalism in there. I think the biggest problem is going to be trying to get the funding in there for it. Certainly, what's coming out of this, I don't think will fund the women's game. But what it can do is, if used properly, you can sort of piggyback on the player pathway development and have the resources that are going into both of it, looking at men's, sort of boys and girls, men's and women's rugby. And I think that will be for the greater good of the IRFU, which allows them then to put in the sort of the fundamentals, the building blocks that will build it all the way up. And it's going to be important again that they get away from that new Sephora model, which was certainly within the women's game was you had to be within the inside the M50 to be to work or to sort of work or play for Ireland, and that needs to change fundamentally as well.
And you mentioned we mentioned women's rugby. We mentioned the old News 4 model of, ignore it and it's not really there or it's not a problem. Probably a good point to bring in David Humphreys here because we are in around this week or in around this month anyway, last year that he took up the role on a full-term basis. So we're 1 year into the David Humphreys era as performance director, and there has been a lot of positives. Like he noticed a problem at Munster and at Connacht and made coaching changes. He has changed the central contracting system twice. We've seen recalls of previously excluded players in the Ireland women's team. Like he was never going to be able to rip up script and have an entirely new Irish rugby system in 1 year. But he's done a pretty good job of establishing what he wants, hasn't he?
He has, I think, like as you say, he can't come in and just smash everything and try build it from the base up. He certainly has to come in and make his stamp on things, and I think he's done that really, really well. He's, as you said, I think the initial change for the 70-30 was probably there before him, but he certainly carried that through and added the extra bit onto it. I think the timing of the announcement on Tuesday was very strategic in a number of ways. First of all, they had to get out in front of the Rika Ione story, because they couldn't the and whether Irish rugby fans want to believe this or not, there is a growing sentiment, not just outside of the provinces here in Ireland, but within European rugby, that Leinster are being supercharged, that it is an unfair advantage. When you look at both the French and the English um, working within salary caps on that and are limited on it, and you see how far ahead Leinster are of that, it's very important. That becomes even more important because you have the Ione story, which he needed to get out in front of, but also because the TV deal for the Investec Champions Cup, or say the overall deal within the Investec Champions Cup is coming up for renegotiation within the sort of the union partners and club sides. That Ireland have to go into that, and they can't go in saying we're just going to continue to do this one super team and everything else is outside of that. They need to show that they're doing something. I think this gives them a little bit of leverage in that conversation. I think within the women's game, as you say, there's been huge changes on and off the pitch. I think, certainly you can see it within the results and the performances, what's happened, with Scott Beamond in there. I think you can see the changes that are being made by Humphreys. It's going to take a long time. And whatever Humphreys does, there are very few things that he can do that will make instant changes. The stuff that happened back in sort of 2014 to 2019 is only really coming to fruition now for Ireland overall. It's going to take 3, 4, 5 years for the stuff Humphreys is doing and implementing now to truly take effect and be visible to a lot of people.
And I think that's the really funny part about it because one of the key things that we'd remember from David Nucifora would be his State of a Nation address. and he'd lay out his KPIs and what they did well and what they did wrong. Whereas with David Humphreys, we got one State of the Nation address where he had that, what proved to be a very telling comment where he said, we're stopping the signing of NIQ props. But then when Munster badly needed a prop, he said yes to Dean Bluler. Yes, he said yes to Slimani, and that was a little bit contentious. But he showed that he can change his mind on things and go with the flow and see what's needed. But also, in the space of, 4 months of this year, he has laid down a marker in terms of what the rules are, which is something the IRFU very rarely did before in terms of here's what the story is. It's very transparent. And maybe that's not all on Humphreys, but some of it has to be. And I want to touch on something you said there about salary cap because ultimately, we are in the negotiation stage for the likes of the URC and the likes of the EPCR, and it does feel like these moves, it kind of strengthens Ireland's hand in some ways because, as you said, if they're seen to be funneling, again, it's a circulation of money really in the Irish system, but if they are seen to be funneling it into Leinster, it would not go down well when you go into your negotiation phases. So to kind of start that European conversation I wanted to touch on anyway, because it's been hot this week. Where would you be on a salary cap in European Rugby, say the URC, for example, to start? And do you see Ireland's hand of negotiations strengthening because they've made these moves and can look at it and say, well, look, we're changing?
And strangely enough, I think a salary cap is unworkable and unsuitable for the URC, and certainly within Ireland, because you get to a point where it comes down to a number, and you're looking at and I don't mean this in a bad way, but how do you compare the IRFU's numbers to the Welsh numbers? How do you compare the IRFU to Italy? How, then that's even in terms of, salaries, money going into it, which is obviously funded at the top level, right, by the unions, which is very different to the club levels that are in the UK and France. Those you need an even playing field for. With the URC, you get into a situation then by why, first of all, the argument is why would you limit what the union can do to develop the game and spend on the game at a club level? So if Ireland are hugely successful, what are they going to do? Just keep cash reserves with that money rather than put it into player development or provincial money, and things like that. There's rules around that because you look at the French salary cap. It's about you can only spend 30, what is it? Or you can spend up to, is it 35% or a third
Something
of
like that,
your
yeah.
budget, your revenue streams coming in has to be spent on salary or can be spent on salary. So it's to stop people just taking in the money and spending everything on it. I don't think that makes sense in an Irish and in a union context. You also have to look about there's problems with currencies, different currencies. There's the value of living even because you take paying someone, 200,000 euros for to live in Dublin versus paying someone in South Africa 200,000 euros is a very different thing in terms of standard of living, cost of living, even money available within that. So like I think there's too many complications within that. It also gets to the point where like I've heard a suggestion which said, okay, name a separate European squad and put a salary cap on that. You're getting into a situation thereby where I think it means for Ireland specifically, you're starting to divulge information around players' contracts and players' values that are very commercially sensitive. And I know that happens in terms of what's there for sort of the Premiership and the top 14, but this is adding international value on top of it. And I think that's where it gets sort of far more complex. So for me, I'm not sure it is. And I think what Humphreys is doing in terms of showing outwardly what in terms of the plan for the 40% and going ahead with that, that's a much bigger thing that he's going to have to do and be more transparent because I believe this sort of 60-40 split would have been a two-line sort of subsection of a paragraph in a Jerry Thornley piece in the Irish exam or in the Irish Times in, a few years ago. This would not have been front and center.
Yeah. No, I do agree. And like my thing is I think the URC, if it wants to take the next step, it will need more or sorry, it would need less of financial volatility because you can't have a situation where the richest team in the league is basically spending three times that of the poorest team in the league, in terms of budgets, because that's not the case in any other rugby league. But as you said, because rugby is so intrinsically tied to the unions, especially at URC level, and the difference in currencies as well, it's so tricky. But kind of on the EPCR thing, because as you said, that's up for discussion as well at the moment. And yes, the IRFU have probably strengthened their hand. There's also a conversation to be had about just the long-term sustainability of EPCR rugby and European rugby, because what we've seen at the weekend, look, Leinster were very, very good and Northampton were very, very good. But as long as we see those drubbings in the last eight of a competition, it's very hard to make a case for it going forward, especially when they're already losing less money to TV deals and there's less people through the gates on, say an average pool stage weekend. Again, it just feels like something has to change there. Do you think it is eventually going to be? Do you think it's going to go? Do you think we see another format change first? What do you think?
I think we'll probably see the death throes of what was the Champions Cup or Heineken Cup or Investec Cup, whatever name you want to put around it. I think they'll do something to try and give it one last revive, but I think it to me it's pretty much dead at this point. I think the clubs know that the only reason that they're in it is for the gates from the home fixtures. Even those are dying slightly off because they know there's no jeopardy within those at the moment, and then you start losing money effectively once you get to the knockouts because the money is taken by EPCR anyway, and the vast majority of it. To me, I think we lose eventually within the next 5 plus years. I think we lose what will be the European competitions. I think the league, the URC, will strengthen, may add more fixtures to make up for it with extra teams. That may mean conferences, which again we've spoken about, we're not fans of. But I think where it will go is that it will lend itself to a more streamlined, and I think it'll be like a World Club Championships that they've talked about previously. So I think you'll get sort of like the top team in the top team or two in the URC, top team or so in the Gallagher, and the top 14 maybe joined by the Super Rugby. And then you start to have little playoffs within that, or certainly games within that you can have pools. It's going to be trying to find a place in the calendar, but if you can move things around to actually facilitate losing 8 game weeks out of the European calendar, and you can replace it with 4, 5, 6 game weeks, whatever way that format plays out in terms of World Club Championship, I think that's the way forward. But you'll have to stack that in a certain period. I don't think that's a sort of you can do it in the current European format where you have 2 games and then a break for a month and another 2 games. I think you're going to have to stack that into a sort of here's a month or a 6 week period that the teams are going to have to play in one block.
Yeah, that's the thing. Because I did the URC pod this weekend, and I just said the European format as it is just ridiculous. It's dying. There's no sign of life in it. Obviously, you always get a reaction of fans who are doing well in the competition, which was very much the case over on our YouTube channel for that. But it just does feel like you can't look at this competition and say that it's progressing. Even the fact that Leinster were in Croke Park for a semi-final last year and against the exact same team they've elected for the Aviva Stadium this year, it's not nothing. Going to the stadium in Bordeaux for Bordeaux's game against Toulouse, like it makes sense again, but these are games that we used to see in bigger stadiums. Like this has a knock-on effect. Like TV viewership when it went back to free to air peaked with clashes between Irish and French teams, but now, as we've seen, I don't think the provinces are in a position to dictate anymore. That it has not been as strong as they would like to see, and it's just hard to see the viability of it because you're at a stage now where it's the same teams. Like Bordeaux have essentially just replaced La Rochelle this year. That's really the
Yeah.
only difference that we have seen. It's been Northampton. Usually the best team in England will be there, to be fair. It's been Leinster, Toulouse, best English team. It was La Rochelle. Now it's Bordeaux. It's hard. It's a hard sell. And I think the quarterfinals proved that. Like we had Munster, Bordeaux was a decent game, probably should have been tighter. The all French affair was brilliant. The other two were just washouts. And that just can't continue. But one last thing we'll get to before we go, because I am conscious of time. That there was big news this morning. And for anyone who's listening to this after the fact, they may not know that the big news on Thursday was, of course, the addition of Johnny Sexton to the Lions coaching staff and the Irish rugby coaching staff on a full-time basis. On with the greatest respect to one of Ireland's greatest ever internationals, we've probably done as much coaching sessions as Johnny Sexton has. And that is something that if you are an elite coach in Scotland or in Wales or in England, that's what you're going to be pointing to. It's really not about what, Johnny did in 2013 or 2017. That's the bit they're going to look at. It's like, but he's not a coach. And this feels like a bit of a disaster optically for the Lions.
It does. I mean, to be honest with you, I think if you were going to do it, it should have been done back at the end of March when they were announcing the coaching ticket. The fact that it wasn't, again, sort of, it seems like they were almost a little bit too embarrassed to do it that day. That day. Um, to me, it's hard to justify on the basis like Sexton, fantastic world class player in his day, has come back and was doing the Irish stuff part time. So he's not even been a full time rugby coach. It's not that he doesn't have the qualifications. It's not that he doesn't have anything else. It's a pure thing of he hasn't even been a full time rugby coach. He hasn't committed to rugby full time. He's only actually going to start full time for rugby but in August, I think, isn't it?
August 1st,
When
yeah.
when he joins the Irish setup. You know, I remember going back like Paul O'Connell, sort of he was called into the Irish um setup and people were sort of going, well, what are his actual credentials? This is a guy who's led the Lions, had the same sort of playing career as Sexton, went off, he had some coaching in Stade Francais and then went and did Irish under 20s. So at least while there was minimal sort of stuff there was something. This is a case of, don't bother changing your uniform too much, Johnny. Just get back out onto the pitch there and start coaching again. And it's very hard. There's no track record there. It doesn't give out. You look at the reactions again, and look, social media is not, I suppose, a true
Not normal.
reflection of, yeah, and no, it's not a true reflection of sentiment, but you do look at it. There is an awful lot of pushback on this. I do think that the way Andy Farrell works, it can be seen in the coaching ticket. It's going to be seen, I imagine, very heavily in less than a month's time when he announces the playing squad. Leinster equals Ireland. Ireland equals Lions. It
Yeah.
is the format isn't going to change too much.
Yeah. No, that's the thing. And like I go back and forth on the Lions. I nearly get more excited for the squad announcement than anything else because you're pitting, how you see the game versus how your friends see the game and so on and so forth, and who your Mr. Versatile is versus theirs. But geez, all I'm saying is if I'm a Cork Ireland fan, the last time we had a Lions tour with this much doubt, Cork went on to win the All Ireland and they're just league champions. And that is lost on all my listeners outside of Ireland. But it's fine because there's a subsect of Cork people who would have enjoyed that line. But it just feels like, oh lads, like I don't know how you sell this to say the Telegraph as is, who probably won't be happy no matter how many Irish players are on it. Like we already hit Stuart Barnes 2 weeks ago, fight with people below his column because they were saying that it should be the British Lions. It should be anything else. And we're basically implying the Irish lads should be kicked out of it anyways. So like, how are you supposed to sell this? And this is the thing, like rugby finds it so hard to sell itself. And then you got this, which to be fair, it's box office. That's the one thing I say about Sexton going on this line tour. It is box office. It's going to be him and Finn Russell in the same room, for example. But at the same time, you were going to have a lot of media pushback, which I think is going to be very interesting to see how Farrell deals with it. But again, that's only if you're interested in the Lions. Not everyone is. Because,
Yeah, I think like for me going back to the Lions and you're talking like when for me it was like 1997, Living with Lions, the documentary, the whole thing. That was one of the big things. And you look at it and it was about getting, for me, looking back at that era, it was all about getting the best players. It wasn't about picking players that fitted a certain system or did whatever. It was more about getting the best players and then finding the system of how to play, how to beat the box. And they that was the way it was. It evolved a little bit under Gatland, I think, a bit more where it became like we're going to pick as much of the Welsh squad as we can and then we'll add to it. Farrell is going to take that to the nth degree, right? I think this is going to be the ultimate thing. This will either make or break the Lions. Um, in terms of that. I also think that once you come back to it, it's a little bit. This is almost this is almost going down the Clive Woodward 2005 route, where you are saying, I am bringing my team, I am doing this, we are going to be successful because we're going to copy the formula that we had from previous that I know works, and we're going to implement it here, and we're going to do everything the same as we did at a national level, and we're going to translate it to the Lions, and it's going to be super successful. And I think even the stuff about Sexton, the coaching setup, this has massive 2005 vibes going off it.
Which, as I said, in and of itself, it's box office because you are excited to see how it unfolds, but at the same time, it's also like it's not, it's also not at the same time, so it's that kind of middle ground. But Owen, I'll let you go because I've kept you for enough. But thank you very much for coming on and just discussing, because I think there was always going to be a very clear misunderstanding of the IRFU's new contracting model and the old contracting model as well. Because as I said, players are not being paid €15 an hour. That's the biggest misconception in Ireland. But it's good to kind of run over it. And then the fact that just the news cycle just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I'm fully expecting, I don't know, the top 14 to merge with Japanese Super League tomorrow or something, or right after we finish recording, because that's just what happens, especially on PSOM yourselves. But Owen, thanks very much. And thanks to everyone for listening. We'll be back on probably Bank Holiday Monday to recap round 4 of the Women's Six Nations. But for now, until next time, take it easy.